Chapter 1 Citizenship Expatriation. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles, from her beacon hand, glows world-wide welcome, her mild eyes command. The air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame, keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. By Emma Lazarus, New York City, 1883. In 1798, Thomas Jefferson instructed that Congress has not unlimited power to provide for the general welfare, but only those specifically enumerated. Wilson Nicholas, a delegate to the Virginia Convention that ratified the Constitution, said, "Congress has power to define and punish for counterfeiting and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the laws of nations, but they cannot define or prescribe the punishment for other crimes whatsoever without violating the Constitution." Chief Justice Marshall said, "The police power unquestionably remains, and ought to remain, with the states." Until this past century, federal courts upheld the view that the federal government could deal only with crimes specifically mentioned in the Constitution. In 1911, the Supreme Court said, "Among the powers of the state not surrendered, which powers therefore remain with the state, is the power to so regulate the relative rights and duties of all within its jurisdiction as to guard the public morals, the public safety, and the public health, as well as to promise the public convenience and the common good." At the founding of this republic, there were only 4 federal crimes: treason, counterfeiting, piracy, and crimes against the law of nations. Now there are 3,000 federal crimes, 300,000 federal administrative regulations, many of which are punishable as crimes, and about 85,000 local governments with 513,000 elected officials, or 1 in every 500 people. We have an estimated 45 million laws, state, federal, and local. God, the creator of the universe, gave us only 10 laws with which to live our lives, and although I fail often, I try to conduct my life by those 10 commandments. It would be impossible, however, to obey 45 million laws. Those millions of laws and the government enforcers are destroying our republic. In 1900, 1 in every $15 went for government use. In the year 2000, it is nearly 1 in every 2. We must contend with 65 times more laws than our grandfathers did at the turn of the 20th century, the most cruel and unjust of those being the tax laws. Every federal program takes on a life of its own, so it will be extremely difficult to transfer power from the federal government to the states. It is difficult to change, much less kill or transfer, a federal program once it has been established, even after it has outlived its usefulness. The New Deal view of an all-powerful central government must be replaced with a firm separation of powers if this republic is to survive. Increasingly in the last 100 years, powerful corporate interests have deliberately subverted the intent of the founders by financing the appointment of judges who would enhance corporate and federal power and weaken the constitutional system of checks and balances. While many today attack the New Deal as representing the demise of constitutional government in America, the assaults actually began in the late 1800s, when federal courts, led by the Supreme Court, started chipping away at state sovereignty. This allowed the federal government to assume numerous duties and responsibilities that under the Constitution have been reserved to the states or the people. Recalcitrant Southern states did not turn to the Supreme Court to leave the Union before the Civil War, partly because the Constitution does not grant the federal courts the right to control state sovereignty. The Constitution did not create a judicial supremacy, and there is extensive evidence that the founders never granted the Supreme Court the power to rule over the President, Congress, or the states. Every July 4th, we honor the signing of the Declaration of Independence. By signing that document, the Founding Fathers, many of whom were deists, pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor to the premise that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, to be secured by a government that was subject to and inferior to the consent of the governed. The British pursued them as traitors to the king. Of the 56 original signers, 9 did not live to see freedom, 5 were imprisoned, and 17 lost everything they had. Their sacrifice for the Constitution of the United States has guided this nation through a continuing effort to bring liberty and justice for all. Can any of us do less? The courage of America's founders was based on their belief in God's providence. George Washington called America's liberties the object of divine protection. James Madison, President and signer of the Constitution, affirmed their beliefs, saying, "Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe." At the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin began the tradition of prayers in Congress, saying, "In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? If our liberty and nation were still under God's protection, none of us would be reading this book. We would be in full measure out in pursuit of our happiness. By rejecting God's plan for our future, we have chosen to adopt man's temporal plan, and we must suffer the consequences of that choice. Many years of legal research has led me down many paths in pursuit of truth. I didn't receive truth in law school, or at any time during my formal education, with the exception of a one-room schoolhouse in Kentucky. That school didn't receive any federal funds for education, so the subject matter the teacher taught was not restricted. Our teacher had a remarkable understanding of the national and state constitution and the framers' intent, along with Thomas Jefferson's negotiations with the state legislature documented in the Kentucky resolutions. Fascinating reading then, visionary in the present day. In later years, far removed from that one-room schoolhouse, what I received at public schools supported by federal grant money was revisionist history and omission of the truth in everything other than the sciences. After all, I had an education controlled by the federal government's money. I was taught what the federal and state governments wanted me to learn, nothing more, and certainly not the truth. The old axiom that truth is the first casualty of war is as close to any truth that you will ever find in your investigation of the federal government. That being the case, we have been lied to by our government and have been at war with our national government for a very long time, and I believe that is the truth. As I write, for each of us within this country, our liberty is perishing, that liberty crushed beneath the constant growth of state and federal government power. More than ever before, the federal, state, and local governments are confiscating citizens' property, trampling rights, and decimating opportunities for any prosperous future you may have hoped for. Since 1933, a concentrated effort has been made to impoverish the people of America. Our wealth has been systematically stripped from us by rapacious taxation and outright theft in the form of usury, interest, and fractional reserve banking policy. Federal agencies publish an average of over 200 pages of new rulings, regulations, and proposals in the Federal Register each business day. The expansion of the federal code is one of the most obvious measures of the increase of administrative control over the citizen. The politician's effort to socially engineer society by an endless multiplication of penalties, prohibitions, taxes, and prison sentences is a dismal failure. What has been lost in their effort is our freedom. The attack on the individual's rights has reached a point in our lives where a citizen has no right to the use of his own land if the bureaucracy determines it to be a wetland, no right to the money in his pocket or bank account if an IRS agent determines he has taxes owed, and no right to his property if a duck, flying south for the winter, lands in a puddle in his backyard. A man's home is his castle, except when a politician wants the land the house is built on for a low-cost housing project. In America today, a citizen's use of his own property is presumed illegal until approved by multiple zoning and planning commissions. Since 1985, federal, state, and local governments have seized the property of over 200,000 Americans under asset forfeiture laws, often with no more evidence of wrongdoing than an unsubstantiated assertion made by an anonymous government informant. Government officials now exert vast arbitrary power over citizens' daily lives, from Equal Employment Opportunity Commission bureaucrats that can levy a $145,000 fine on a St. Louis small businessman because he did not have 8.45 minorities on his payroll, to the Minnesota and Wisconsin Departments of Natural Resources, which regulate property so that you may not use the lake or swamp contained on your land because an endangered mouse species lives nearby. Federal agricultural bureaucrats can prohibit Arizona farmers from selling 58% of their fresh lemons to other Americans. Customs Service inspectors can destroy import shipments without compensating the owners. Federal bank regulators are officially empowered to seize the assets of any citizen for allegedly violating written or unwritten banking regulations. Federal regulations dictate what price milk must sell for, what size California nectarines can be sold, what crops a person may grow on his own land, what apparel items a woman may sew in her own home, and how old a person must be to buy a beer, even though he is old enough to die for his country. The Internal Revenue Service is carrying out a massive campaign against the self-employed that seeks to force over half of America's independent contractors to abandon their own businesses. NAFTA and GATT agreements are forcing small industries into bankruptcy because their customers have moved to Mexico or Indonesia. Government agencies are more out of control than ever before, and the Supreme Court, the supposed bastion and protector of the Bill of Rights, has ratified the power of these federal employees. Privacy is vanishing beneath the rising flood tide of government power. Government officials have asserted a de facto right to search anybody, anytime, on the pretext of terrorism. The average American now has no freedom from having government agents strip search his children, rummage through his luggage, ransack his house, sift through his bank records, and trespass in his fields. Today, a citizen's constitutional right to privacy can be nullified by the sniff of a dog. Federal officials have given rewards to hundreds of airline ticket clerks for reporting the names of individuals who paid for their tickets in cash, thereby allowing police to confiscate the rest of people's money on mere suspicion of illegal behavior. Local police are conducting programs in 200,000 classrooms that sometimes result in young children informing police on parents who violate drug laws. The number of federally authorized wiretaps has almost quadrupled since 1980, except the ones intended to catch spies of our nuclear secrets, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation is trying to prohibit development of new types of phones that would be more difficult to wiretap. The demagogues in Congress are rabid with the intent of taking away our right to carry and bear arms. Could this description of events occurring in the United States today have applied to pre-war Nazi Germany? Freedom of speech and freedom of the press are increasingly under assault. The proliferation of vague federal regulations have had a severe chilling effect on the free speech of millions of businessmen who cannot criticize federal agencies without risking reprisal that could destroy them. Thanks to a 1992 federal appeals court decision and a late 1993 congressional uproar, even pictures of clothed children can now be considered pornographic, thus greatly increasing the number of Americans who can be prosecuted for violating obscenity laws by taking pictures of their own children. The government is manufacturing more criminals now than ever before. It is increasingly choosing the citizen target, creating the crime, and then vigorously prosecuting the violator. During the past 15 years, law enforcement officials have set up thousands of elaborate schemes to entrap people for crimes such as buying plant supplies, asking for a job, or shooting deer. Hundreds of private accountants have become double agents, receiving government kickbacks for betraying their clients to the IRS. Total federal spending has increased from under $100 billion in 1963 to over $3 trillion in 2002. And as spending has grown, so has bureaucratic control and political power. Since 1960, the federal government has created over 1,000 new subsidy programs for everything from medical care to housing, from culture to transportation. Subsidies are the 20th century's method of human conquest. Slow political coups d'etats over one sector of the economy and society after another. Government subsidies have become a major factor in squeezing out unsubsidized developers, unsubsidized schools, unsubsidized theater producers, and unsubsidized farmers. The money is extorted out of the lifeblood of the citizen by rapacious and unlawful taxes, while the subsidies slowly smother his freedom. A government powerful enough to give you everything is powerful enough to take everything away. Former President Clinton set aside 1.7 million acres of Utah to be protected by the federal government. That sounds warm and fuzzy until you understand that the land federalized was the nation's largest reserve of soft coal. The electric utilities must now buy their coal for electric generation from Indonesia. Soft coal owned by the Lipo Group, the same organization that donated millions to Clinton's election campaign. Beggaring the taxpayer has become the main achievement of the welfare state. The federal tax system is turning individuals into sharecroppers of their own lives. The private economy has become an agent of the federal government. At least 50% of the total productive resources of our nation are now being organized through the political market in the form of taxes. In that very important sense, we are more than half socialist. The average American now works over half of each year simply to pay the cost of government tax and regulation. High taxes have created a moral inversion in the relationship between the citizen and the state. Before the income tax, the government existed to serve the people, at least in some vague nominal sense. Now the people exist to provide financial gain for the state's mill. Federal court decisions have often bent over backward to stress that citizens' rights are nearly null and void in conflicts with the Internal Revenue Service. IRS seizures of private property have increased by 600% since 1980 and now hit over 3 million Americans each year. Not only do we have more laws and regulations than ever before, but the laws themselves are becoming less clear, consistent, or coherent. An example is the tax code. In 1913, a debate was held on the Senate floor regarding the first Income Tax Act under the 16th Amendment. Senator Elihu Root commented about the complexity of that first law. His comment was humorous then. It is hilarious now. I guess you will have to go to jail. If that is the result of not understanding the income tax law, I shall meet you there. We shall have a merry, merry time, for all of our friends will be there. It will be an intellectual center, for no one understands the income tax law except persons who have not sufficient intelligence to understand the questions that arise under it. All the confusion over an 80-page act then is exponentially compounded now by the current 10,000-plus page Internal Revenue Code 26 U.S.C., along with more than 30,000 pages of implementing internal revenue regulations, 26 CFR and some borrowed from 27 CFR. It is now practically impossible for citizens to keep track of government's latest edicts. Today, the law has become a tool with which to force people to behave in ways politicians approve, which is politically correct, rather than a clear line that citizens can respect in order to live their lives in privacy and peace. With the proliferation of retroactive regulations, government agencies now have the right to change the rules of the game at any time, even after the game is over. The rule of John Ashcroft, whereby federal officials on a whim create new rules to bind and penalize private citizens, has replaced the rule of law, the classical concept endorsed by the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 as a restraint on government power. Each night we are deluged with cop shows that reveal how far out of its box the beast of government has crawled. Government agents dressed like military commandos wearing black jumpsuits, bulletproof vests, and armament that would give a seasoned military force pause to reflect, wear full head masks to conceal their identity. No one busy doing the constitutional work of the Republic needs to wear ski masks concealing their identity. Criminals and outlaws wear masks, not constitutional officers. They bash in doors and throw the inhabitants to the floor, screaming children watching in horror as their parents are manacled and dragged off to prison. The government is supposed to set the example that we, the citizens, are required to emulate. When the government breaks the law, then there exists no law. We have anarchy. That, I am afraid, is the state of the Union as of today. In the famous Supreme Court case of Elkins et al. Versus United States, 364 U.S. 206, the court, reinforcing judicial integrity, stated, "In a government of laws, existence of the government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself, and it invites anarchy." The time in which Justice Brandeis spoke was a simpler time, and the government had not broken the chains with which the Constitution bound it down. Unfortunately, the federal judiciary has opted out of the separation of powers doctrine of the Constitution, and now has become self-regulating. The courts do not maintain their independence as a judiciary. Without constitutional authority, the system elevates judges above the law. The courts are no longer our courts of justice or a bastion of freedom. With the passage of the War Powers Act of 1933, they have become the executive's tool. The judges are little more than organized crime families. They have invaded the people's court, and now only impersonate and give lip service to justice by exchanging obfuscation and sophistry in place of a justice system, void of any form of judicial integrity. Enforcing judicial standards on judges under this system is impossible. Even though the court has rules, the judges make up their own rules as they go, or break the rules with impunity whenever it is convenient for them to do so. How can you take a judge to court when the judges control the court and have granted themselves immunity from prosecution? How do you call the police when it is the police who are breaking the law? The judge's dishonesty is contagious, and the government as teacher has sown the seeds of discontent and anarchy. The Lord God Almighty has granted a judge immense power to judge his creation, we the people. But along with that power comes immense responsibility, in that the Lord, on the day of judgment, will hold each judge to a higher standard of judgment. The people have learned their lessons well. They follow by example, and the example of the courts and the criminal justice system has led the people to behave criminally, just as Justice Brandeis predicted. Government now appears more concerned with dictating personal behavior and political correctness than with protecting citizens from the private violence of murderers, muggers, and rapists. In 1990, for the first time in history, the number of people sentenced to prison for drug violations exceeded the number of people sentenced for violent crime. The number of people incarcerated in federal and state prisons in 2001 was almost 4 times the number incarcerated in 1980, and America now has a higher percentage of its population in prison than any other country in the world, 2 million people. If those on probation and parole are taken into account, the number controlled by the justice system is over 6 million. So much for the land of the free and home of the brave, which is now just another oxymoron akin to military intelligence. Unfortunately, the more that government has tried to manage people's behavior, the more unmanageable American society has become. Gangs have replaced families, resulting in a greater proliferation of drugs and illegal weapons. Our babies are becoming parents with no jobs or education, spiraling an entire generation of children into grinding poverty and third world expectations of life. We have lost our moral compass as a people and have embraced a secular view of morality rather than God's. This observable fact, as America has entered the new millennium, is the circumstance of the New World Order, as envisioned and planned for a very long time by the international banking cartel and the United Nations. Oppression has become more refined and more insidious in recent decades. We frequently see scenes like IRS agents dragging Amish tax resistors out of their scanty homes, or the Los Angeles police beating a suspect. We can expect to see the frequency of similar scenarios escalate as we are pushed forward into a global government and the New World Order. The fact that only a minimum number of people physically resist government agents is not confirmation that the state is violating fewer people's rights. The level of tyranny imposed by government agencies is less evident today primarily because the vast majority of citizens capitulate to government demands before the government resorts to enforcement. America is ripe for a cataclysmic revolution. The lack of an armed uprising is not evidence of a lack of discontent and hostility. 6 corporations presently control all forms of media, newspaper, TV, radio, etc., in the United States, and they have been diligent accomplices in a massive cover-up of federal crimes and oppression of the people. Many Americans apparently believe politicians and policy experts have been wise enough to create a government that does not crush the people it was created to protect and serve. The question of individual liberty is now often marketed as a question of a ruler's intentions toward the citizens. But lasting institutions are far more important than transient intentions. The last 75 years have seen the sapping of most constitutional restraints on capricious government power. American political assessment suffers from a predisposition to appraise government by exalted ideals rather than by insipid and shocking reality. We have a romantic tendency to judge politicians by their dictum rather than by their day-to-day actions, and a tendency to view the growth of government power by its promise rather than by its results. The decline of liberty is not primarily from specific acts of government, but from the collective force of hundreds of thousands of decrees, hundreds of taxes, and thousands of officials with unrestricted power over other Americans. Our political leaders say they have tried to improve the quality of life by multiplying the amount of intimidations, by militarizing police power, by giving one group of people the power of invention over others as to how they must conduct their affairs. The power accumulating in a central government is not put on display at the Smithsonian Institute. It is exercised in day-to-day life. The larger it becomes, the more oppressive it will become, regardless of the intentions of those who advocate larger government. The average American's understanding of liberty and the threat to its survival has declined sharply since the nation's birth. The Massachusetts colonists rebelled after British agents received writs of assistance that allowed them to search any colonist's property. Modern Americans submit passively to law enforcement sweep searches of buses, schools, and housing projects without valid search warrants. Virginia revolted in part because King George imposed a 2-pence tax on the sale of a pound of tea. Americans today are complacent while Congress imposes billions of dollars in taxes, increasing the projected federal debt into double-digit trillions. Federal agencies have the power to act as prosecutor, judge, and jury in suits against private citizens. Maine revolted primarily because the British Parliament issued a decree confiscating every white pine tree in the colony. Modern Americans are largely complacent when local regulatory agencies impose almost unlimited restrictions on individuals' rights to use their own property. The initial battles of the Revolution occurred after British troops tried to seize the colonists' private weapons. Today, residents in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and other cities submit to de facto prohibition on handgun ownership imposed by the same government that grossly fails to protect the citizen from private violence. The 1775 Revolution was largely a revolt against growing arbitrary power. Nowadays, seemingly the only principle is to have no political principle, to judge each act of government in a vacuum, to assume that each expansion of government power and nullification of individual rights will have no future impact. The Founding Fathers looked with horror at the liberties that they were losing, while modern Americans focus myopically on the freedoms that they still retain. America needs fewer laws, not more prisons. The Founding Fathers realized that some amount of government was necessary in order to prevent a war of all against all. By trying to seize far more power than is necessary or granted by the Constitution over American citizens, the federal government is destroying its own legitimacy. We face a choice not of anarchy or fascism, but a choice of limited or unlimited government. Because it is a necessary evil, it is necessary to vigilantly limit government's disruption of citizens' lives. We, the people, delegated to ourselves the responsibility as the ultimate protector of the Constitution. We, the people, are the ultimate court. When our government is unwilling or refuses to abide by the constitutional mandates we required, it is our sacred duty to stand up against that government and to either alter or abolish it. But oppression remains an evil that must be minimized in a free society. The ideal is not to abolish all government, but to structure it so as to achieve the greatest respect for citizens' rights and the least violation of their liberty. The question is not whether Americans have lost all their liberties, but whether the average American is becoming less free with each passing year, with each session of Congress, with each new shelf row of Federal Register publications. American liberty can still be rescued from the encroachment of government. The first step to saving our liberty is to realize how much we have already lost, how we lost it, and how we will continue to lose our liberties unless fundamental political changes occur. I would propose that the Constitution be amended to require that the entire House of Representatives be composed only of females and the Senate be composed only of males. That would be a natural balance of power. It works in families. Why not Congress and the American family? The most recent example of congressional action and loss of liberty can be found in the new Patriot Act, short for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. This act of Congress primarily expands existing law, giving federal law enforcement agencies greater intelligence-gathering power, and has the effect of curtailing or eroding constitutional protections for citizens. In the wake of September 11th, most of us believed that the law might be reasonable in granting enforcement agencies those expanded powers, but the facts as have been revealed by Congress do not support that contention. That tragedy occurred not because of inadequate anti-terrorism law, but because of the Federal Intelligence Agency's own internal procedural failure. The Patriot Act does not, therefore, help us to fight terrorism better. What it does do is 1. It upsets the balance of power in our government, putting unnecessary power in the hands of the executive, and brings us one step closer to what Chancellor Hitler achieved in pre-war Germany. 2. Increases the administrative burden on presently overburdened intelligence agencies, making terrorism more difficult for them to fight. 3. Destroys many of our hard-won, unalienable rights and liberties for which so many of our ancestors and our own generation fought and died. The Patriot Act is a complicated law. I have assembled for this chapter the sections which I feel are most troubling, specifically the Patriot Act. 1. Permits agents of law enforcement to enter and search your home in secret without ever informing you. The U.S. Constitution requires not only probable cause to search, but that you are notified of the search. Section 213 of the Patriot Act disembowels the notice requirement of the Fourth Amendment. 2. Section 216 of the Act permits agents of the government to tap your phone or computer without probable cause having been established. Under this section, a judge must authorize a warrant as long as law enforcement agents certify that the surveillance is relevant to an ongoing criminal investigation. No probable cause of criminal activity is required to issue the warrant, and the criminal activity does not have to have anything to do with terrorism. This violates the probable cause provision of the Fourth Amendment. So, for all intents and purposes, the Fourth Amendment is a dead letter. 3. In addition, Section 218 permits the government agent to carry out secret searches and wiretaps without showing probable cause, merely by certifying that there is a significant foreign intelligence purpose. This also evades the Fourth Amendment protection. 4. Section 411, in tandem with Section 802, expands the power of government to designate a group as a foreign terrorist organization. Any group which endorses so-called terrorist activity, which under 802 may be otherwise a lawful protest activity, can be designated as a terrorist organization. This would enable government to designate such groups as the California tree huggers, protesters in Puerto Rico objecting to bombing of their land, or those protesters against the World Trade Organization as terrorists, such as in Seattle, New York, Chicago, and Washington. Goodbye First Amendment. 5. Section 411 also allows the government to indict anyone who provides material support or assistance to a terrorist organization. It is now possible for the federal government to determine that a domestic organization is in fact a terrorist group, i.e., the Michigan Militia, or Save a Patriot, American rights litigators, or any group who may disagree with government policy. One man makes the determination of terrorist, the president. No evidence is necessary, and no court can stop that designation. No more Fifth Amendment. 6. Section 412 of the Patriot Act permits the government to arrest and detain immigrants indefinitely for nothing more than a visa violation. In fact, of the 1,200 known immigrant detentions since 9/11, the ACLU determined that only about 5 had been detained on terrorism-related charges. 7. Section 802 creates the crime of domestic terrorism. This criminalizes any acts of any member of the public that merely appear to the government's determination to be intended to influence the policy of the government by intimidation or coercion, or to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. This section would make just about any act of civil disobedience in protest against government policy into an act of domestic terrorism. Anyone who responds in writing to the IRS by objecting to one of its decisions could and probably will be labeled a domestic terrorist. There goes the Fifth Amendment. Our Congress, at the urging of the President and the Attorney General, has enacted criminal, unconstitutional legislation. As an example of its new application, we now see what is planned for the rest of us. Attorney General John Ashcroft said, "If you don't agree with the government, you are a terrorist." Attorney General Ashcroft pushed the U.S. Patriot Act through an overwhelmingly dim-witted Congress soon after September 11th. He has subverted more elements of the Bill of Rights than any Attorney General in American history. This is the same man who was beaten by a dead man in his bid for the Senate. Under the Justice Department's new definition of enemy combatant, which won the enthusiastic approval of the President and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, anyone can be defined as an enemy combatant, very much including American citizens, and they can be held indefinitely by the government without charges, a hearing, or lawyer. In short, incommunicado. Goodbye the entire Bill of Rights. Now more Americans are also going to be dispossessed of every fundamental legal right in our system of justice and put into camps. Ashcroft's Terrorism FBI Guidelines. The nature of the conduct engaged in by a terrorist enterprise will justify an inference that the standard for opening a criminal justice investigation is satisfied, even if there are no known statements by participants that advocate or indicate planning for violence or other prohibited acts. That conduct can be simply intimidating the government, according to the USA Patriot Act. This book would qualify under those guidelines. The following words of Thomas Jefferson from the Kentucky Resolution sound as though they were written yesterday in describing the Patriot Act. That if the acts before specified should stand, these conclusions would flow from them: that the general government may place any act they think proper on the list of crimes, and punish it themselves, whether enumerated or not enumerated by the Constitution, as cognizable by them; that they may transfer its cognizance to the President or any other person who may himself be the accuser, counsel, judge, and jury, whose suspicions may be the evidence, his order the sentence, his officer the executioner, and his breast the sole record of the transaction; that a very numerous and valuable description of the inhabitants of these states being, by this precedent, reduced, as outlaws, to the absolute dominion of one man, and the barrier of the Constitution thus swept away from us all, no rampart now remains against the passions and the powers of a majority in Congress to protect from a like exportation, or other more grievous punishment, the minority of the same body, the legislatures, judges, governors, and councilors of the states, nor their other peaceable inhabitants, who may venture to reclaim the constitutional rights and liberties of the states and the people, or who for other causes, good or bad, may be obnoxious to the views or marked by the suspicions of the President, or be thought dangerous to his or their election, or other interests, public or personal. Jefferson's statement is as valid in 2003 as it was in 1798. It lends a chilling historical perspective to the present Patriot Act and our present condition compared to events in America in 1798 brought on by the Alien and Sedition Act, Whiskey Rebellion. Congress and the other branches of the federal government are not a party to the Constitution. They are products of it. The Constitution vests Congress with certain delegated authorities under Article 1. Nothing more. Within its own borders, state authority is antecedent to that of the United States, and as parties to the Constitution, the several states have both the right and responsibility to correct their agent, the United States, when ambition seeks to abuse or expand powers which have been delegated. Of more immediate importance where the instant matter is concerned, those who exceed the law, whether of the state or the United States, are accountable to the law of the land and ultimately to the people of the land within the several states. Operation under color of law is outlaw, criminal, and accountability must be in law. Judges, magistrates, attorneys for the Department of Justice, and enforcement people do not have immunity when they exceed the law as it is written. This war on terrorism is not a war at all. Congress is the only constitutional body that can declare war. It is a convenient tool being used by the President to expand power and control over each of us citizens, nothing more. The government will not be happy until the last vestiges of our Constitution are torn from us, leaving no protection from the servitude expected from us all. The federal government has never kept its word in either the conduct of internal policy, Constitution, in treaties with the Indians, or in international policy. The course of conduct being displayed by the government is merely ensuring the new generations of terrorists are being created at home as well as abroad. The Constitution was written and the federal government created in order to ensure that all of our liberties were protected even during times of war. They have failed miserably in that task. Ashcroft now says that we will protect you, but some of your liberties must be surrendered to enable us to protect you. Rubbish! It is time that all Americans with courage say to the federal government, "Go to hell." There can be no higher expression of patriotism than opposing your government when you believe they are wrong. That should be the responsibility of our state governments, but they have bought into the federal agenda because it expands their power and control over us, and they are no better than the federal fascists that they emulate. Freedom is a word not often reflected on by us. Thomas Jefferson said, "Freedom is not free. The price we must pay for freedom is eternal vigilance." Collectively, we have not been vigilant, and now we can see the result of our apathy. It is not too late to correct our agent, the federal and state governments. Individually, we are not a threat to the vested interests of the new king, but collectively, we can still control if we wake up and smell the dead, rotting corpse of this once great republic. Together we must demand that they cease and desist in their plan for world domination and control over us before the United States of America crashes, smoking and burning, upon the scrap pile of history. When I left the battlefield of Southeast Asia, I vowed that I would never again take up arms against another human being, and I never will. But as long as I have a breath in my body and a right of freedom of expression, I will educate, agitate, and indoctrinate as many of my fellow Americans as possible in order to stop or delay this march into madness that we are now on. The administration forced a vote on the Patriot Act before many legislators even had a chance to read it. That is the way the world elite always slip in legislation that destroys our freedom. That is the way the War Powers Act of 1933, the Federal Reserve Act, and the 16th and 17th Amendments to the Constitution all were passed into law. Then, NAFTA, GATT, and countless other laws were shoved down our throat because Congress has no backbone or are co-conspirators in treason. The Patriot Act passed by a majority of 337 to 79. We must prevent these changes from becoming malignant and spreading to the body politic. Insist that Congress requires these anti-terrorism laws be re-examined in a few years before they become permanent. This is your only chance to protest what may end up being the most significant event in our nation's history, events that your grandchildren will not forgive you for if you do nothing. Some people argue that we live in a lenient society that has more than enough liberty, that we can afford to lose some. Others have argued that only those people who are criminals or buying and selling drugs or gun owners have concern about the Bill of Rights. Some might think my perception is too negative. They are probably correct. But being a sentinel for freedom is my responsibility and yours as well if we wish to remain a great nation. On my way to Hawaii 3 weeks after the New York tragedy, I was sitting next to a young woman who worked for the World Bank in Washington. She maintained those sentiments. As I excused myself and moved to another seat, I told her that I was not going to spend the next 7 hours listening to an idiot mouth concepts about which she has absolutely no understanding of the gravity of her conclusions. In my opinion, most of the general population who espouse those beliefs do not have the brains God gave a goose. They don't realize that once the freedom is given away, it will never be returned, and the rights which are used by criminals to evade incarceration are the same rights which protect each of us. If one is denied that right, so too will all be denied that right. In undergraduate school, I took several American history courses, as that subject has been of interest to me for the last 30 years, and it is an excellent foundation for law. But I discovered that what was written in the history books was not the same as what was written in the settled case law of that same time period. The law is where the true history of a nation is found, not in a revisionist history book. This nation's history is composed of many great dreams and ambitions which were sacrificed upon the altar of pragmatism, necessity, circumstance, and thousands of dead heroes. Our constitutional rights are like that. The government has never simultaneously observed all the first 10 amendments to the Constitution for the United States of America as they are actually written. The government, all 3 branches, has always been quick to say, "That's not what they meant," as if we are too stupid to read the simple language of that compact and understand the founders' intent. And that's in good times. In dreadful times, when things get difficult and Americans are concerned, distressed, or angry, things get suddenly worse. This has been true from the very start of our nation. Here are some examples of American history that we were not taught in school. The second president, John Adams, a founding father, a forefather of yours truly, someone who should have known better, got the Alien and Sedition Acts passed. That law allowed the deportation of any non-citizen who was judged to be dangerous to the United States, even if the country was not actually at war. No trial was required. The Sedition Act made criticizing the government a prison offense. These laws were passed and used to silence the public's opposition to Adams' foreign policy, especially used to imprison newspaper publishers of the opposing political party, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. A long time ago, right? That may be so, but it was the beginning of a tradition within our body politic. In the 20th century, there was the infamous Sedition Act in World War I. It was used to jail social reformers, activists, and other people with whom the government disagreed, and, if they were non-citizens, to expel them. Specifically, it made speaking out against war a prison offense. Prominent journalists and civil libertarians were jailed for merely reading from the Constitution. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the famous liberal Supreme Court justice, voted to uphold this curtailment of the First Amendment with his now famous statement comparing the activism for peace during war to shouting fire in a crowded theater. I have often believed that a judge is a lawyer with a 50 IQ, nothing more. The next shameful event in our history, which still plagues us to this day, was the War Powers Act of 1933. This act permitted President Roosevelt to make law in the form of executive order, bypass Congress, and create his socialist state. We, citizens of this country, were ever afraid to be considered enemies of the United States who must be licensed to engage in any commercial activity. With the aid of the Federal Reserve, the same people who created the Depression, the president confiscated our gold and silver coin and replaced it with worthless pieces of paper and a debt system that will eventually destroy this great country. Our land and our labor were pledged to the Federal Reserve Bank Incorporated as collateral for a debt system that could never be paid. How can this most important event in our history not be taught in school? Everyone knows about the imprisonment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. All people of Japanese descent, even natural-born Americans, were subject to detention in prison camps. The federal government jailed 120,000 men, women, and children for 3 years for the crime of being Japanese. The Supreme Court upheld the capture, internment, and the effective seizure of their property. That fact alone confirms my theory that they all have IQs of 50 or lower. The Smith Act, also passed during this period in 1940 before America's entry into World War II, mandated the fingerprinting and registration of all aliens in the United States. To be an unregistered alien was against the law. This law also outlawed all organizations that advocated the overthrow of the government, perhaps a reasonable measure in war, but this law was passed during peacetime. The Smith Act was abused to jail labor leaders, socialists, and communists who were opposed to the ways of the robber baron capitalists, the very ones who created the conditions for the Great Depression. The Red Scare of the 30s and the communist witch hunt of the 40s and 50s ruined many American lives. Their only crime was to know the wrong people, or to hold liberal opinions, or to have such opinions in their youth, and the gall to stand up to demagogues and others who used anti-communism as the key to increasing their own power. The 1950 Internal Security Act, passed by a supermajority to override Truman's veto, required registration of people and groups who were communists or who had beliefs similar to communists. It created detention centers around the country, which would be filled with FBI-identified subversives if the president declared an emergency. Those detention centers are still in existence, and new ones have been built all over this country to hold us. There are over 43 of them at present under the direct control of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. More recently, many are familiar with the history of the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement. Did you also know that the FBI's Operation Co-Intelligence Program, COINTELPRO, approved at the highest levels of government, had as its object the suppression of those who worked to change the system. It was used to intimidate the membership, discredit leadership, and even put into jail those who fought for freedom and peace, in a manner that was not only grossly immoral, but also completely illegal. That was only 30 years ago. And there is Watergate and Nixon's inches-thick list of enemies. He used the power of the IRS, FBI, Customs, and other federal agencies to harass or eliminate his political opponents and everyone he suspected of disloyalty or political opposition. That took place only 25 years ago. And now, after 25 years of drug war and a drug war-friendly Supreme Court, we've seen our protections under the Fourth and Fifth Amendments eroded to nothing. All of these deprivations of liberty are always under the pretext of some alleged war. We're at a watershed point in our nation's history. Not everyone who cries, "We must fight terrorism," is really a friend of the Republic and freedom. Some people think that we should live in a society with a lot fewer civil rights. They believe that some opinions should be illegal, some activism should be forbidden. It is this type of individual that permeates the Congress and the federal judiciary. Will these new laws affect you? Maybe not at first, perhaps. They'll be used to stop people with whose opinions you disagree, to jail civilian militiamen from Montana and Michigan, to put a stop to the KKK, ACLU, Operation Rescue, or Greenpeace. Depending on your political beliefs, that's a good thing, right? But the way of judging such a law is not how it operates today, but how it will operate when your most feared enemy is in control. Who is your most feared enemy? If no one you know now qualifies for that position, imagine what use these new laws could be put to by Hitler, Stalin, Osama bin Laden, or even George Bush Jr. How would you safeguard your freedom and those of your friends and family when your opinions are labeled as terrorist? My point is this: freedom walks a very narrow road. On one side of that road stands conformity, censorship of ideas, and the use of force to compel people in their role as citizen or antagonist. On the other side stands social engineering and political dissent. The only thing in the middle of the road is dead skunks and ignorant people. That narrow road is supported by the Bill of Rights and the settled case law which support our rights. There's nothing magical about the Constitution. It's a dead tree ground into paper so those immortal, heavenly concepts of freedom and self-government could be memorialized. It's a document written by people for people and interpreted by other people. It can be followed or it can be ignored. If it's followed, there are a few precious fundamental restrictions on government actions against the individual. There is in the Constitution, for instance, a guarantee of due process of law before life, liberty, or property is taken from you. This isn't a guarantee that you won't be wrongly prosecuted, or that you won't be investigated or even punished for your beliefs. It's only a guarantee of exposure to other people, your fellow peers and the press, including some judges who will be watching to see that the rules are being followed. Sometimes that exposure is enough to make the difference. Sometimes it's not. The judges are there only to make sure that the rules were followed. Justice does not reside in the courtroom. If you want justice, go to church. That's in God's hands. All the judiciary cares about is if the rules were followed. Nothing more. The same Congress that has legislated our freedoms away writes the rules. But when, by our apathy, we set aside those few guarantees contained in the Constitution, when we allow searches made in secret, the seizure of property without trial, the detention of people without proof of a crime or opportunity to defend themselves, then that force of democracy becomes a paradigm for disaster. Our silence is freedom's death knell. People suffer because those who have and exercise power are imperfect people. They always make mistakes. They get eager in protecting us, and, in so doing, forget that the actions of the overeager bureaucracy are the clear and present danger to the people. Some of them have a desire to exercise and abuse their power, to silence their antagonists, to persecute those who are different from them, to make others bow to their demands. Those types of individuals make great prison guards, politicians, and judges. A strongly respected constitution helps keep a restraint on all that. Nothing but God can stop a government that is resolute to ignore its constitution. The War Powers Act, Alien and Sedition Acts, Red Scare, Watergate, COINTELPRO, and now the Patriot Act are examples in our shameful history that illustrate a government completely out of control. But the Constitution was drafted in order to make things safer by introducing safeguards. Competing interests and the separation of powers doctrine between the three branches of government, each jealously protecting its own power, are the instruments by which our freedoms are enforced, or should be. When they are not, then you'd better watch your ass if your opinions are unpopular, unpalatable, or even dangerous to the status quo. The first rule of watching your ass is making sure that you don't look or sound like an enemy of the state. It's called the ostrich strategy. Self-censorship is always the first step in the loss of freedom, lest you draw attention and the power of those who might do you harm for speaking your opinion. Self-censorship makes it easier for further, more draconian steps to be taken, as no one says, "Stop, this is unconstitutional." We fear that if we said that, we might be singled out for government reprisal. When Hitler attacked the Jews, I was not a Jew, therefore I was not concerned. And when Hitler attacked the Catholics, I was not a Catholic, and therefore I was not concerned. And when Hitler attacked the unions and the industrialists, I was not a member of the unions, and I was not concerned. Then they attacked me and the Protestant Church, and there was nobody left to be concerned. This quote is from a pastor who opposed Nazism in Hitler's Germany. He was speaking for the reaction or lack thereof of all people of goodwill in Germany to the events that transpired there. It's the silence of people of goodwill that allow manifest evil and fascism to entrench itself. Evil can flourish only when men of goodwill do nothing, is an ancient maxim that has profound meaning in our time. I am not saying that the U.S. government is filled with Nazis. God willing, that specific species of human lunacy will never return. But the lessons learned in the fight against fascism should always live within us like a festering boil on the surface of our consciousness. Don't be silent, and don't censor yourself. Speak out against those in power and let them know you disagree and that you are watching their every move. This is the responsibility of citizens in a republic. I believe a republic's strength does not result from voting. In our country, half don't vote because there isn't much in the way of a choice. There is Daryl, my brother Daryl, and my other brother Daryl. Not a penny difference between them. But we still have a strong country because people have a right and feel safe in expressing dissatisfaction. This operates as a relief valve for our frustrations and criticisms of those in power. There's a partition between our leaders and us that has grown larger with each passing year and each new shelf row of Federal Register publications. Many of our representatives are hearing only the call from the President and Attorney General to give them more power in order to make us safe from terrorism, no matter the cost, no matter the loss of precious freedom. Absolute safety can be achieved only in a police state, and then it is the state that is the source of all terrorism. This has been the story of human societies from time immemorial. Few of these new laws are made for the prosecution of a war on foreign terrorists. We already have every legal tool needed to do this. The purpose of most of these changes is for the collection of more information about Americans without the regulation of a judge and the restrictions imposed by the Constitution. The law already allows intelligence and investigative agencies to spy on foreigners without any serious obstacle. These laws can be only for the monitoring and imprisonment of those living in the U.S. who have differing opinions of what makes for a fair and just society, citizen or foreigner. The government's opinion may be diametrically opposed to your own. Our war right now is against terrorism in the Middle East. The first people targeted in this country will be Arabs and Muslims. Since I'm not Arab or Muslim, it is none my concern. Next will be the civilian state militias. Since I am not a member of the militia, it is none my concern. Next will be the Christians with their belief in a power higher than the government. Will there be anyone left to object? We, as the unified voice of we the people, must, when the first of us is targeted, shout out from the highest hill, "Go to hell!" Citizenship Repudiation by Melvin Stamper, J.D., sui juris. To Madeleine Albright, as the Secretary of State of the United States, Washington, District of Columbia. Affidavit/assertory oath and revocation of citizenship. This is to certify that I, Melvin Stamper, was born January 7th, 1940, in the Sovereign Republic State of Kentucky. I presently live upon the land of the Sovereign Republic State of Florida. I am not a resident or citizen of the United States Government, Corporation, whose situs is Washington, the District of Columbia. My relationship to that federal entity as far as jurisdiction is that of a non-resident alien to the corporate United States government. I am a free and natural human man, described by the Lord God as a living soul, living under the common law and the fear of God. I have assumed among the powers of the earth, granted by the Lord God Almighty, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle me. Therefore, in order to secure the blessing of liberty to my posterity and myself, to reacquire my birthright as a member of the sovereign body of we the people, I hereby asseverate and revoke my citizenship, if any ever existed, with the legal fiction known as the United States Government Corporation. I further rescind any and all feudal contracts with that federal government, its agencies, and with the state of Florida and its agencies. I have rescinded the Social Security number fraudulently issued me by the government at the tender age of 13, as I was legally incompetent to enter into a legal contract with the government. The government, by misinformation, led me to believe at that time that I was required to secure a Social Security account number in order to gain employment, which is simply not true. The government agent who obligated me to that Social Security system knew, or should have known, that there existed serious liabilities to anyone who accepted a Social Security number. That agent had a fiduciary responsibility to inform me of the true nature of the Social Security Trust account and the obligations and liabilities that the trust involved. By the government's silence on the matter, the government established, by fraud, a constructive trust agreement with me which must be vitiated. Since receiving that account, I have had through my religious instruction come to the belief that the Social Security number may be what is referred to in the Holy Bible, Book of Revelation, chapter 13, verses 16 through 18, and chapter 14, verses 9 through 10, as the mark of the beast, or at the least its precursor. For me to participate in that program and continue to use that number may place my eternal soul in jeopardy. This I will not and cannot do. The money which I have paid into that socialist system for over 40 years, including the moneys paid by my employer's demand, is hereby made for full reimbursement to me. I do not wish, nor am I permitted by God, to make myself a ward of the state, as would be the case if I accepted the Social Security benefits. I demand the same treatment that was given to the people of the Philippines, who were participants in the Social Security Trust and choose citizenship of the Philippines over that of the United States. As the Social Security program is not a feudal contract, in that Congress gave no property rights for a Social Security Trust account, I demand the contract be voided and all monies returned, as would be the case for any fraudulent contract or constructive trust agreement. The United States government should not enrich itself from the fruits of a poisonous tree. I emphatically deny that I have ever filed for bankruptcy protection, nor have I ever given my power of attorney to anyone, or to the state of Florida, or any of the Union states, or the United States Corporation government, for the purpose of instituting a bankruptcy action in my name, nor granting that my labor and or my property of whatever kind, or wherever situated, be held as collateral in any bankruptcy proceeding of the state or federal governments. nor any scheme, using my labor and property as collateral, to support or fund a fiat money scheme of the Federal Reserve Bank Incorporated and or the state of Florida and or federal United States government. 3 generations of a proud and patriotic family will suffer the anxiety of their spirit as a result of my having chosen to recognize the malignant and treasonous misconduct of this government and speak out against it. Some of my reasons for repudiating that citizenship status are defined in the following articles, and by the totality of this document are made a part hereof. I have lived a productive and eventful life, now in anticipation of the end and God's mercy. Undoubtedly the singularly most horrific moment of that life was the conviction to repudiate my citizenship of the United States. Those words, repudiate my citizenship, crushed the very soul within me. I stand now beneath that flag I served with pride for nearly 40 years. The memories of our brave young men, my comrades in arms, who defended the Constitution, who never had a life, flood before me. They sacrificed all of their tomorrows so that I might have mine. Those memories will always remain with me and be remembered with humble honor and gratitude. The awful knowledge and horror of betrayal by my own government, of which I was once so proud, is an unbearable sorrow that I must now carry to my grave, but I shall do so a free man. Perhaps the American people are like the frog that is heated slowly to a boil in a pot of water. If we had detected the heat sooner, we could have jumped out, saving the Republic and ourselves. But alas, our grandfathers were asleep at the helm, and not as vigilant as they were instructed to be by Thomas Jefferson. Americans are now awakening to the cataclysmic reality of a fascist, one-world government, having replaced our intended constitutional republican government. Article 1. The Declaration of Independence for the United States of America clearly outlined the necessary course each citizen must take when his government became insufferable. Over the past 60 years, nearly all of our unalienable rights have been stripped from us through the sophistry and obfuscation of the courts and bloodlust of the Congress for spending debt-based money borne on the back of the American people. What they have done is egregious, but as the Declaration of Independence points out, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. By sufferable, I believe they meant survivable. That same declaration also declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it." Since 1933, beginning with the confiscation of our gold and alloidal property, rather than secure our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, our government has persistently and systematically reduced our standard of living. But this evil seemed survivable, so we just suffered and let it pass, letting the water get a little hotter. Since 1933, our government has refused to secure our right to life, land, or liberty by persistently increasing our burden by regulations, prohibitions, legalized abortion, and unlawful taxes. They have bastardized our judicial system with statutory law, replacing the common law and the protections which it afforded us with the severe and brutal equity/admiralty jurisdictions, where the Constitution is of no protection. They have lied and withheld the truth about the jury's power to judge the law as well as the facts, all but turning the jury system into a prosecutor's tool, and not our protection from overzealous prosecutors that it was intended to be. They have increased our prison population to nearly 1.5 million inmates, the largest imprisonment of its own citizens of any country in the world. They now prepare plans for new prison construction for the new millennium, projecting 20 years in advance and building cells for our as yet unborn children, as though all or most of our offspring will be criminals. This reality alone reduces the expression, the home of the brave and the land of the free, to mere illusion and an oxymoron. But these evils were/are also sufferable, and we let the water get hotter. Article 2. Now, the United States government not only refuses to secure our right to life, it is openly seeking to diminish or even eliminate that right in order that a foreign people we neither know nor see might survive. Thanks to the UN, New World Order, NAFTA, GATT, and every whore, coward, and traitor elected or appointed to American public office that voted in favor of those dastardly treaties, our very survival as a people is now at stake. Our government's evils are no longer sufferable. The La Paz portion of the NAFTA agreement provides for the forfeiture of a 30-mile wide strip of American soil to a foreign power, the UN, across the entire 1,935 miles of border between Mexico and the USA. Roughly 60,000 square miles of American soil is being surrendered without a single shot being fired. That's more land than is contained in Rhode Island, Delaware, Connecticut, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Hawaii combined, constituting the single greatest act of treachery in the history of this nation. Even more land is being surrendered as national parks are converted to UN biospheres. Thank the Lord that the legislature of Kentucky flat out refused to go along with the surrender of any of their land to a UN biosphere. There is no provision in the Constitution for Congress, the President, or the courts to surrender any portion of our national sovereignty to any foreign government. I am positive that there is no provision in any state constitution for those states along the Mexican border to surrender any portion of their state sovereignty to a foreign power. Those legislators who swore to uphold the national Constitution have violated their oath to God and the American people's trust. Our incumbent politicians are guilty of treason and should so be accused and tried. The justification for surrendering our sovereignty to the UN, New World Order, is found in their ecological argument. The Earth is overpopulated and its resources are inadequate to support our species. The human population must be reduced by at least half if our species are to survive. If that argument is accurate, then there is not enough food or resources to sustain all currently living human life. In any other time throughout the history of human society, such shortages as described by the ecological pundits would precipitate violence and unimagined wars as individuals, families, and entire nations struggled for scarce resources in their survival against other human competitors. Such has been true since time immemorial. Under such extreme circumstances, where a foreign power or population might threaten your survival and mine, we would inevitably deduce that foreign power or population was our mortal enemy. After all, for them to survive, we must die, or at least condemn our children and ourselves to a diminished lifespan. According to Article 3, Section 3, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. If the world is on the threshold of a life-or-death Malthusian battle over scarce resource, what more aid and comfort? If the world is on the threshold of a life-or-death Malthusian battle over scarce resources, what more aid and comfort could this government possibly provide to a foreign people or power than to voluntarily surrender our nuclear technology to China for political campaign contributions, the surrender of our land and sovereignty to the UN, as well as our very lives, so that some foreign competitors, our mortal enemies, might survive? Will the American people just sit back like the frog and let the water boil, letting this government sacrifice their children's lives and futures to benefit some foreign slaves or aborigines? I don't think so, And I, for one, in the capacity of a citizen, want no part of this moronic agenda with that insane policy. The United States Constitution is a contract between the federal government and the states of the Union. Its fundamental and guiding principle is the idea that the state is always a potential source of corruptive power and ultimate tyranny. Originally, the federal government's responsibilities were confined to a few enumerated powers, involving mainly national security and public safety. In the realm of domestic affairs, the founders sought to guarantee that federal interference in the daily lives of citizens would be strictly limited. They also wanted to make sure government would have a minimal role in the domestic economy and that it would be financed and delivered at the state and local levels, not by an evil and pestilential central banking system, as is the Federal Reserve Bank Incorporated. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the enumerated powers of the federal government to spend money are defined. These powers include the right to establish post offices and post roads, raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, declare war, and to conduct a few other activities related mostly to national defense. No matter how long one may search, it is impossible to find in the Constitution any language that authorizes at least 90% of the civilian programs that Congress crams into the federal budget every day. The federal government has no authority to pay money to farmers, run the healthcare industry, impose wage and price controls, give welfare to the poor and unemployed. They have no authority to provide job training, subsidize electricity and telephone service, lend money to businesses and foreign governments, or build parking garages, tennis courts, and swimming pools. But they do. The founders did not create a Department of Commerce, a Department of Education, or a Department of Housing and Urban Development. This was no oversight. They did not believe that government was authorized to establish such agencies. They were correct. Congress is forbidden by the Constitution to establish any such agencies. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution states clearly and unambiguously, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. In other words, if the Constitution doesn't specifically permit the federal government to do something, then it doesn't have the right to do it. May God have mercy on your soul for bankrupting and enslaving our people. Article 4. The Bill of Rights clearly defines the most often government-abused individual liberties. It forbids the federal government to violate any of these unalienable rights of the people and reserves all other rights of a sovereign not delegated to the United States to the states. The states' authority and sovereign rights would be determined by the people in their individual state constitutions. All sovereign rights not delegated to the federal or state governments by the people remains with the people. On April 19, 1993, at Waco, Texas, the United States Corporation showed its utter contempt for the unalienable rights of its citizens and the sovereigns of its creation. 86 men, women, and children were murdered by agents of the FBI and BATF with the sanction of the executive branch of that government. An internal investigation by the Department of Justice, the fox asked to investigate the fox in the henhouse, determined that the agents of the government perpetrated no criminal acts. The majority of this nation's population knows it was murder and will never forgive nor forget this manifestly evil work. I can no longer abide in this government's unlawful conduct and moral bankruptcy, because as a citizen, by proxy, I am guilty also. This is one of the many reasons I must sever my relationship with the United States Corporation government to ease the heavy burden on my soul these foul deeds have laden it with. The water has gotten too hot for me. Article 4. I am not anti-government, anti-military, or anti-American. For 12 years I served in the United States Marine Corps in both active and inactive duty all over the world. I served an additional 9 years as a police officer, always defending the Constitution of the United States of America, always in harm's way. Veterans like me joined the military because of our love of country and our constitutional obligation. At all times I have defended our Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. When I volunteered, I never imagined there were any real domestic enemies. Today I know otherwise. The following is a partial example of the activities of those domestic enemies. In 1997, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette exposed the Tuskegee experiment. It was conducted for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972. According to the Associated Press, the government withheld treatment from 399 black men with syphilis so they could study how it spread and kills. In 1997, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette exposed the Tuskegee experiment. It was conducted for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972. According to the Associated Press, the government withheld treatment from 399 black men with syphilis so they could study how it spreads and kills. That's not an experiment, that's genocide. Whether it happens to one black man, or 10 Eskimos, or 3 Hispanics, it is wrong and violates everything this country stands for. President Clinton publicly apologized on behalf of this government to the aging male survivors. But it wasn't just the 399 men who were damaged. Their spouses also got the disease, causing their children to be born deformed. All told, 6,000 Americans were sickened, deformed, or killed as a result of the United States government's Tuskegee experiment to study how syphilis kills. President Clinton didn't bother to acknowledge their suffering. In 1977, during the Senatorial Select Committee on Intelligence hearings, reported in Project MKUltra, the CIA's program of research and behavior modification, the CIA revealed that over 40 universities and institutions were involved in extensive testing and experimentation using covert drugs on unwitting citizens at all social levels. In 1977, the University of Maryland newspaper reported that during the 1950s and 1960s, 44 colleges, 15 research foundations, 12 hospitals, and 3 prisons knowingly participated in MKUltra experiments, but people that were experimented upon were never informed or asked to consent to be guinea pigs. Project MKUltra was one of the biggest military experiments. There were 149 sub-projects, and lasted for years. It included human drug and biological testing by the Department of Defense, DoD, under the direction of the CIA over entire American communities. The Bureau of Narcotics and even the IRS participated in MKUltra. When you see these government documents, they are more frightening than the rumors because our government actually admits to participating in these experiments. In 1950, the United States government released bacteria, Serratia marcescens, that cause pneumonia and urinary tract infections into the San Francisco Bay. The bacteria were aerosolized by the surf and blown inland to study how effective an offensive biological weapon would be against the people of San Francisco. According to the report, it blew 50 miles inland. People died as a result of that experiment. Incidentally, the amount of Serratia marcescens still remaining in San Francisco is 3 times the national average. It follows that we can legitimately ask how much of the syphilis that we have in the South today is a direct result of conducting the Tuskegee experiment for 40 years when they could have stopped it. How much of today's other diseases are a result of government experiments? Is it possible, as some have published, that AIDS is a product of one of these government experiments? At the U.S. Army Biological Weapons Research Facility at Fort Detrick, Maryland, weaponized mosquitoes were developed. They actually grew viruses inside mosquitoes, placed the mosquitoes in balloons, released the balloons from aircraft over American communities, and infected people. They had to infect people to tell how far the disease went and how far it would spread. How many of today's diseases are direct results of those experiments? Tuskegee was not a one-time anecdote, it's just the tip of an iceberg that indicates they're still doing experiments on the American people. Another experiment was done in 1966 at Keesler Air Force Base. In 1966, 12,000 recruits at Keesler received the mycoplasma vaccine. Obviously another experiment. MK Ultra considered various means of controlling human behavior. It was literally a mind control project. MK Action was funded with CIA money through the Geschichter Foundation at Georgetown University. In the 1977 congressional hearing, Dr. Geschichter testified that during the Vietnamese War, the CIA didn't know if various Vietnamese nationals were double agents. Therefore, the CIA included a material in the anti-cholera vaccine given to pro-American Vietnamese, which made them glow when they were exposed to an ultraviolet light and helped identify those who rejoined the Viet Cong. This may be a clever wartime strategy, but it illustrates that as early as the 1960s, our government used vaccinations for purposes other than the prevention of disease. The 1977 Senate hearing report, Biological Testing Involving Human Subjects by the Department of Defense, actually says that unwitting American people were involved in open-air testing. For example, it says, the Army was using live organisms which we know can infect human beings. The Food and Drug Administration allowed it. Entire cities were involved in the testing of these biological agents. Our government even placed biological warfare agents in the New York City subway to see how many people would be infected. They did the same thing in Pennsylvania's Kittatinny and Tuscarora Turnpike tunnels. You would drive through and receive aerosolized bacteriological agents. MK Naomi, a biological project from the 1950s through 1969, which exposed 6 entire towns, including Fort McClellan, Alabama, San Francisco, California, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and St. Louis, Missouri, to biological warfare agents dropped out of aircraft to see how many people would become ill. They say MK Naomi ended in 1969. Why should I believe them? On page 160 of the 1977 Human Drug Testing by the CIA Senate Report S-1893, they discussed EA3167, a compound they could rub up against you and it would absorb into your skin and kill you. They tested it in Pennsylvania and Kentucky prisons. It was applied to the skin through some type of adhesive tape. They also did this on military and civilian people without telling them what they were exposed to or getting their informed consent, as if anyone would volunteer. The primary excuse for nearly going to war against with Iraq in February 1998 was the suspicion that Iraq had been conducting biological experiments on its own prisoners. If those experiments are evil for Iraq, how then can they be legal, moral, or ethical in the United States of America? Have you clones of hydrocarbon base gone completely insane? In 1997 congressional hearings, the Army admitted conducting these experiments but argued, "We just didn't tell you about it because nobody was hurt and there was no problem." No problem? I have a serious problem with this outrageous conduct. Title 50, Chapter 32, Section 1520 permits the government to experiment on us with biological and chemical agents. Thanks to a treacherous Congress, it is now legal for the DoD or their contractors to experiment with biological and chemical agents on the American people. The only proviso Congress imposes on them is that at least 2 unspecified local officials be notified within the subject community, and they could be the garbage collector or the water meter reader. Once that major communication event occurs, the test can begin within 30 days. But we are not told. Our children aren't told. No problem? And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened up with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice from heaven, saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 through 5. As one of God's people, I must now also leave Babylon the Great, and not partake of her sins any longer, lest I receive her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God will remember her iniquities. May God have mercy on the United States. Conclusion. On every front, with blinding speed and inexhaustible power, the evil forces of darkness of the New World Order are closing a ring of fire on freedom. In every domain and field of human endeavor, the choking, suffocating idolatry permeates all fields of human thought, corrupting our language, destroying truth and justice, demolishing integrity and virtue, enacting totalitarian legislation, and controlling education and communications. Above all, the vilest evil is the destruction of our unborn children, a thing so horribly vile that even maggots and filth do not do. Then the attack on our faith and its foundations of biblical thought and experience, demonizing God's followers as religiously right-wing zealots to be held in ill repute, ever rapidly expanding its deviancy of evil, closing the parameters on the just as the United States collapses inextricably into Babylon. What malevolent force of darkness captains the ship of state for Columbia, the gem of the ocean? God save me, but the United States government is no longer sufferable. I can tolerate its pernicious and predatory conduct no longer as a citizen of the United States corporate fiction. I hereby repudiate, rescind, renounce, and disavow any citizenship status with the United States government that I may have inadvertently acquired by any scheme, for the reasons detailed in the foregoing articles. My birthright now being resecured as a member of the sovereign body of free men and women known as Americans, I hereby pledge my allegiance. America demands no less from me in that freedom has never been free. My love for the United States of America has never been stronger. So help me God, Lord Jesus, come quickly. Dated the 2nd day of September in the year of our Lord, 1998. Melvin Stamper, J.D., sui juris. Supporting Statutes, Title 25 U.S.C. 1999. Whereas the right of expatriation is a natural and inherent right of all people, indispensable to the enjoyment of the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and whereas in the recognition received emigrants from all nations and vested them with the rights of citizenship, and whereas it is claimed that such American citizens, with their descendants, are subjects of foreign states, owing allegiance to the government thereof, and whereas it is necessary to the maintenance of the public peace that this claim of foreign allegiance should be promptly and finally disavowed. Therefore, any declaration, instruction, opinion, order, or decision of an officer of the United States which denies, restricts, impairs, or questions the right of expatriation is declared inconsistent with the fundamental principles of the Republic. The above statute reads like it was meant for foreigners who come to this country from all over the world. Definitions are all important in the reading of any legal writing. The definition most important in the above statute is the words foreign states. So let's look at some other statutes, Supreme Court decisions, and dictionary definitions that shed more light on those words. The Constitution was made for states, not territories, wrote Daniel Webster. The Constitution of the United States as such does not under it extend beyond the limits of the states which are united by and under it, wrote Arthur Langdell in The Status of Our New Territories, 12 Harvard Law Review, 365, 371. Judicial note should be taken that the United States Constitution always denoted citizen and person in capital letters prior to the 14th Amendment. Thereafter, citizen and person were not capitalized. The distinction between citizen of the United States and United States citizens has been fully recognized by the Congress and the courts as follows. We have in our political system a government of the United States and a government of each of the several states. Each one of these governments is distinct from the others, and each has citizens of its own who owe it allegiance, and whose rights, within its jurisdiction, it must protect. Emphasis added. The federal government is a state, a foreign country or nation. The several United States are considered foreign to each other except as regards their relations as common members of the Union. Black's Law Dictionary, 6th edition, page 1407. Congress identifies the citizens of the district as individuals, or citizens who reside in the United States, and who are subject to the direct control of Congress in its local taxing and other municipal laws. Asking one question can clear up the distinction between the two types of citizen. Are both classes of citizenship the same, and, if not, what is the difference? Citizens of the United States have the right of suffrage, right to vote. District citizens have no such right. If you are not a United States citizen of Washington, D.C., or the territories and possessions, then what are you in relation to the federal government? Non-resident alien. At first, that term does not seem to describe your relationship to the federal government, but federal income tax law and the Supreme Court enlighten greater understanding of the term. The revenue laws do not use the term sovereign citizen. Those laws refer to United States persons, resident aliens, and non-resident aliens. U.S. persons are defined to include, among other things, citizens and residents, i.e., resident aliens of the United States. Treasury Decision TD 2313. The Supreme Court decision on a tax case determined the issue. Brushaber v. Union Pacific Railroad Co., Inc., 240 U.S. 1, 1916 is often cited by the IRS as demonstrating its authority to collect income tax and that the income tax is constitutional, limited application. What the IRS fails to mention, and what is not apparent from looking at the court's ruling in the case, is that the case concerned income from within the United States accruing to a non-resident alien, which is subject to the federal income tax because he was involved in a trade or business with a federally chartered corporation. Treasury Decision 2313, in elaborating on the case, makes this apparent. Under the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in the case of Brushaber v. Union Pacific Railroad Co., decided January 24, 1916, it is hereby held that income accruing to non-resident aliens in the form of interest from the bonds and dividends on the stock of domestic corporations is subject to the income tax imposed by the Act of October 3, 1913. Treasury Decision 2313. It is based upon the decision of the Supreme Court in a lawsuit brought by a citizen of New York living in Brooklyn against the Union Pacific Railway Co., a federally chartered corporation. The purpose of the suit was to prevent the railway company from withholding the 1% tax from the dividends payable to the New Yorker. The state citizen lost that case. In reliance upon that decision, the Treasury Department referred to the New Yorker as a non-resident alien who, as such, was not exempt from the withholdings of taxes from dividends payable by a domestic corporation, i.e., chartered by the federal government. The fact that TD 2313 called Mr. Brushaber a non-resident alien seems proof enough that citizens of states are non-resident aliens for all purposes of the Code, and if this is true, then a corporation chartered in a state is foreign, while only federally chartered corporations can be domestic. So, anything done in a state is done without the United States. The Treasury Department actually confirmed their understanding by their analysis of the Brushaber case on the status of a sovereign citizen as being a non-resident alien for revenue purposes. A non-resident alien is anyone who is neither a citizen nor a resident alien of the United States. Since the sovereign citizen is not a citizen of the United States under the Code, by virtue of the definition in the regulations, and since he does not fit that definition of a resident alien, by elimination, he must be a non-resident alien. The term alien must apply to the sovereign citizen because he is alien to the status of subject citizen, and he does not fit the special definition of resident found in the 14th Amendment. It may also be said that, since the sovereign person does not live within the political jurisdiction of the United States, he is non-resident thereto. Thus, he can be non-resident to the place, as well as non-resident and alien to the status of subject citizen. Under the language of the Code, as interpreted by the tax regulations, the sovereign citizen may be liable for the tax applicable to the non-resident alien. The Code subjects non-resident aliens to taxes upon income which is received either from a trade or business effectively connected with the United States, or from a source within the United States. Do not assume that this means some places as foreign as France or Japan. It appears to refer to the 50 states just as clearly as did TD 2313. As to taxability of non-resident alien income, in order for such income of the non-resident alien to be taxable, it will have to emanate from sources within sovereign federal areas or from an activity that is effectively connected with the political jurisdiction of the United States by reasons of the ATF laws, patents, copyrights, federally created entities, etc. If it emanates from any of the 50 states and is not connected with those federally controlled activities, such income is not taxable to the sovereign citizen. Once again, the problem is to find a court that will apply this truth. To do this, one must show to the court that an activity in one of the 50 states is without the United States. To do this, it is suggested that a standard form subpoena, as issued by the clerk of any United States District Court, be marked as an exhibit. Point to the return of service which states that it is signed under penalties of perjury pursuant to the laws of the United States of America. Then attach it to a motion which cites 28 U.S.C. section 1746, 1. This statute defines that form of verification is applicable only without the United States. Also cite 28 U.S.C. section 297, showing that the 50 freely associated compact states are referred to as countries. Combined with the Brushaber case and TD 2313, one would make it hard for the court to deny that income from within the 50 states is without the United States. Since you have always been a non-resident alien of the United States, it seems absurd that you would be required to prove it with rebuttal evidence, but that is exactly what you have to do. The government and the courts are not going to let you easily out of the system that it took them so long to put in place to fund their criminal activity. Through its regulations, the government has made it difficult to expatriate, as they require that you leave the country and do the deed at a consulate or embassy. However, President Bush may have made the task a little easier since he has declared war against terrorists as 6. Formally renouncing U.S. citizenship within the U.S., but only in time of war, Section 349A6 INA. Simply address the document to the Attorney General per the regulation. There exists mountains of supporting evidence and court decisions regarding your true status, and it seems absolutely preposterous to require you to jump over obstacles in order to expatriate. But if it were made easy, then everyone would be doing it. Again, this is one of the most important decisions of your life, so do not approach it in a cavalier manner. Study as much as you can, and ask the good Lord for direction before making that decision. The preceding is an example of one individual's expatriation document. Do not copy it word for word. As you can see, it was a heartfelt effort and of a personal nature, as yours should be. Notice that taxes were not even a consideration, as having taxes as one's motivating reason makes the attempt a failure.